The summer of 1987 arrived in Harlan County, Kentucky, the way it always did, without asking permission and without mercy. By the second week of June, the heat had cracked the clay soil into puzzle pieces so precise they looked deliberate, and the air sat heavy enough that breathing it felt like work. Earl Sutton stood at the western edge of his back 40, looking at what 3 years of neglect had turned into a wall of green so thick and tangled it might as well have been a fence. Multi-floor rose, honeysuckle, sumac with canes thick as a man's wrist. The kind of growth that doesn't just spread, it conquers. And once it takes hold, it doesn't let go. Earl knew this. He had known it for 3 seasons. He had watched it creep forward each spring, watched it thicken each summer, watched it dig roots deeper each fall. And he had done nothing, not from laziness, from watching, from thinking, from remembering. He was 61 years old. The land beneath his boots, 80 acres of Kentucky hillside and bottomland, had been in the Sutton family since his grandfather cleared it in 1911. His father, George Sutton, had farmed it through the Depression. Earl had inherited it in 1953, the year his father died, and he had worked it every season since. 34 years of planting, 34 years of harvest, 34 years of watching the land tell him what it needed if he was patient enough to listen. The back 40 had been telling him something for 3 years. He just hadn't been ready to hear it yet. Earl turned and walked back toward the house, his boots stirring dust from the gravel drive. The June heat pressed down on his shoulders. Inside the house, a white clapboard 2-story his grandfather had built, he sat at the kitchen table and opened the envelope he had been avoiding for 2 days. First National Bank of Harlan County. The return address was printed in that efficient, impersonal font that banks use when they want you to understand this is business, not conversation. Earl unfolded the letter. He read it once. Then he read it again slower. The language was polite, professional, but the meaning was clear. The bank had reassessed the value of his property as part of a routine countywide evaluation, and due to the ongoing degradation of tillable acreage in the northwest parcel, the assessed value of the Sutton farm had declined by 18% over the past 3 years. If the trend continued, the bank would be required to reevaluate the terms of the existing agricultural loans secured against the property. In simpler words, fix the land or lose it. Earl set the letter down. He looked out the kitchen window at the barn, the same barn his father had rebuilt in 1940 after the original one burned. Beyond the barn, barely visible through the haze, the back 40 sat waiting. 80 acres, 3 generations, and now a letter that said it might not be enough. He had no children. His wife Catherine had died in 1979, 8 years gone now, and they had never had kids. There were no heirs, no son to pass the land to, no daughter to carry the name forward. When Earl Sutton died, the land would go to a cousin in Ohio he hadn't spoken to in 15 years, or it would go to the bank, or it would go to whoever showed up at the auction with enough cash to meet the minimum bid. Unless he did something about the back 40. The next morning, Earl drove his 1984 Yamaha Moto4 ATV down Route 7 to Ray Bellamy's place. Ray was 63, a tobacco farmer who had sold his allotment 2 years prior and now spent most of his time buying and selling equipment out of his barn. Earl found him working on a hay baler in the open bay. "Got something I want to sell," Earl said. Ray straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag. "The four-wheeler, yeah." Ray looked past Earl at the ATV parked in the gravel. "That's a good machine. You've kept it clean. It runs fine. Why sell it?" Earl didn't answer right away. He looked at the ATV. He had bought it 3 years ago, used from a dealer in Lexington. It was the first recreational thing he had purchased in his entire life. He had told himself it was practical, easier to check fence lines, move around the property, haul small loads. But the truth was simpler. He had turned 60, and he wanted something that made him feel like he still had time to enjoy. He had ridden it maybe 40 times. "Need the money," Earl said. Ray studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll give you 1,100. They shook hands. Ray paid in cash, counted out in 20s and 50s on the hood of his truck. Earl folded the bills into his wallet, and Ray drove him back to the Sutton farm in his own truck so Earl could pick up his Chevy. "You in some kind of trouble?" Ray asked as they pulled into the drive. "No," Earl said. "Just need to take care of something." Ray didn't push. That was the way of it in Harlan County. You didn't ask questions a man wasn't offering to answer. Earl drove Ray's truck, Ray following in his own vehicle, to the Combs farm on the eastern side of the county. Virgil Combs raised goats, not for show, not for hobby, for brush clearing, though Virgil also sold the occasional animal for meat when someone asked. Earl had called ahead. Virgil was waiting in the yard when they pulled up a borrowed stock trailer already hitched to his own truck. "You said 4, Virgil asked. "3 dozen," a Billy, Earl said. "Bore cross if you have got them." Virgil led him out to the pens. The animals were healthy, muscled, alert. Boar crosses, part meat goat, part Spanish scrub stock. Tough animals, built for rough forage and heavy work. Earl walked the pen looking at their feet, their coats, the way they held themselves. He pointed out 3 does and a mature billy with heavy shoulders and a scarred nose. "That one's got some miles on him," Virgil said, nodding at the billy. "Good," Earl said. "I need him to work, not look pretty." Virgil quoted $900 for all 4. Earl counted out the cash. They loaded the animals into the trailer, and Ray drove Earl and the goats back to the Sutton farm. By noon, the 4 animals were standing in the back 40, inside a temporary enclosure Earl had rigged up the night before with poly wire and step-in posts. Ray helped unload them, then stood at the fence looking at the wall of brush beyond. "You really think they're going to clear all that?" "Yes," Earl said. Ray shook his head. "I think you just traded a good 4-wheeler for 4 goats that are going to stand in the same brush come September." "Maybe," Earl said. Ray climbed into his truck. "Good luck, Earl." Earl watched him drive away. Then he turned back to the goats. The billy was already moving toward the brush line, his head low, testing the canes with his nose. One of the does followed. Earl leaned against the fence and watched them work. He didn't tell Ray the truth because Ray wouldn't have understood it. The truth was this: Earl Sutton had tried machines once. In 1964, he had rented a brush hog and a tractor to clear a section of the property that had grown up while he was dealing with a difficult harvest year. The machine had handled the small stuff well enough, the saplings, the thin cane, the volunteer growth. But the mature multiflora rose, and the thick honeysuckle had defeated it entirely. Or rather, the machine had cut it down and it had come back harder the following spring, the root systems completely undisturbed, more aggressive than before. He had spent $340 on that rental. By 1966, the brush was back and worse. He had not made that mistake again. What Earl understood, what his father had taught him in the summer of 1938, when Earl was 12 years old and the country was still clawing its way out of the Depression, was that machines cut plants. Animals kill them. A machine takes the top. An animal takes the life. George Sutton had kept goats through the 1930s. Not for milk, not for meat, for survival. When the grass was gone and the money was gone, and the equipment sat rusting because there was no cash for fuel or parts, the goats had kept the land from swallowing the fields whole. They had eaten what nothing else would touch, and they had asked for almost nothing in return. Earl had been 12 years old when his father walked him out to the back pasture and showed him what 3 years of goat grazing had done to a field that had been impenetrable scrub before they started. George Sutton had knelt down, pulled a handful of soil, and held it up. He hadn't said anything. He had just let the boy look. The roots of the brush were gone. The soil was loose. The land was ready. Earl had never forgotten the weight of that handful of dirt. Now, 50 years later, he stood at the fence and watched his own animals begin the same work his father's animals had done. The billy bent a tall cane of multiflora rose, with his chest stripped the bark in long curls with his teeth, and moved to the next one. The does spread out, each working her own line into the thicket, methodical and unhurried. Earl turned and walked back to the house. He had work to do. By the end of the first week, half of Harlan County knew about it. The story reached Dale Whitfield before supper on June 11th. Dale was 34 years old, held a degree in agricultural extension and management. from the University of Kentucky and had spent the better part of the last 2 years managing the county's agricultural extension office out of a small brick building on Main Street. He had launched what he called the Modern Land Management Initiative, a program designed to bring scientific data-driven practices to Harlan County's aging farming community. The county had printed brochures. There had been a meeting at the fairgrounds. Dale had driven out to 14 different farms, personally clipboard in hand, spreadsheet on his laptop to explain the economics of mechanical brush clearing. He had quoted Earl Sutton a price of $14,200 to clear the back 40 using contracted equipment, a forestry mulcher mounted on a tracked skid steer arranged through a company out of Lexington. The quote included labor fuel, 2 days of work, and hauling. Dale had been proud of that number. He thought it was fair. He thought it was progress. Earl had listened to the whole presentation standing in his driveway, arms folded across his chest, expression unreadable. And then he had said he would think on it. That had been 11 months ago, now sitting at the counter of the Main Street diner with a plate of meatloaf going cold in front of him. Dale listened to Phil Caudle tell the story with a tone somewhere between disbelief and amusement. He sold his four-wheeler, Phil said, traded it to Ray Bellamy for $1,100 cash, then turned around and bought 4 goats from Virgil Combs, turned them loose on the back 40 yesterday morning. Dale set his fork down. Goats, that's what Ray said. 4 goats. Yep. Dale picked up his coffee, took a sip, set it back down. Phil, that brush back there is 6-7 feet tall in some spots. Multiflora rose and canes thick as your thumb. Honeysuckle matted so deep you couldn't walk through it with a machete. I know, those are goats. Phil shrugged. I'm just telling you what I heard. Dale paid for his meal and drove out to the Sutton farm that evening. He found Earl standing near the fence line of the back 40, hands in his pockets, watching the animals work. The goats were barely visible in the chest-high growth, just their backs moving slowly through the green like small boats in deep water. Dale leaned against his county truck, a white 1985 Ford F-150 with the extension office logo on the door, and watched for a moment. Then he called out, Earl, you understand that brush back there is 6-7 feet in some spots. Earl didn't turn around. I know what's back there. Those are goats. I know what they are. Dale looked at the field. He looked at the goats. He took his cap off, ran a hand through his hair, put the cap back on. Earl, I priced that job at $14,000. The forestry mulcher from Lexington can clear that in 2 days. Those animals. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Those animals are going to be standing in that same brush come September. Earl turned around then. He looked at Dale without any particular expression. His face was weathered-lined deep from 6 decades outdoors, and his eyes were the pale gray blue of river stones. You want to come back in 60 days and see what it looks like, Earl said. Dale opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the goats again. I've got better things to do with 60 days, he said finally. He got back in his truck and left. He told the story at the diner the next morning. By the end of the week, it had settled into the county the way stories do, hardened into a fixed shape, repeated in a specific tone. The story was this: old Earl Sutton had lost his mind and put goats on his back 40 instead of hiring professionals to clear it with modern equipment. The punchline never changed. The laughter was always the same. Earl heard the story, of course. Harlan County was small enough that everyone heard everything eventually. He didn't respond to it. He didn't defend himself. He simply went about his work the way he always had. Every morning he was up at 5:15. He fed the goats, checked the temporary fence, walked the cleared sections, what few there were in those early weeks, and noted the progress in a small wire-bound notebook he kept in his shirt pocket. He had been keeping that notebook for 30 years. It held planting dates, weather observations, equipment notes, soil readings taken by hand. Now it held goat data dates, acreage, feed consumption, visible progress. The goats worked from dawn to dusk. They didn't care about the heat. They didn't care about the county's opinion. They were hungry, and the brush was food, and that was enough. By the end of June, they had cleared a visible section along the western fence line. Not finished. Cleared. Soil visible. Stumps stripped to pale wood. If you stood at the fence and looked at where the goats had been working, it looked like a different parcel of land entirely. Earl noticed it the way he noticed everything without showing anything on his face. He moved the temporary electric fence opening the next section of brush. The goats moved through the opening without being driven and went to work the same morning. He told no one. On the afternoon of June 28th, a boy appeared at the fence. His name was Tommy Prater. He was 14 years old, the son of Earl's northern neighbor, and he had been watching the goats from a distance for the past 2 weeks. Now he stood at the fence rail, one boot on the bottom wire, watching the billy strip bark from a thick cane of honeysuckle. Earl walked up beside him quiet. "They really eat all that?" Tommy asked. "They do," Earl said. Tommy watched for a while longer. "My dad says you're wasting your time." Earl didn't respond to that. He just stood beside the boy and watched the goats work. After a while, Tommy turned to look at him. "Why do you think it'll work?" Earl thought about it. Not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to give the boy the right one. "A machine does one thing and leaves," Earl said. "An animal lives there. An animal comes back every morning and does the same thing again. The plant is trying to survive. The animal is trying to eat. The animal has more patience." Tommy turned this over in his head the way a boy that age does when something lands sideways and he's trying to figure out which way is up. "That makes sense to you?" Earl asked. "I think so," Tommy said. Earl nodded. "Good." The boy came back 3 more times that week. Earl never invited him, never told him to leave. Just let him stand there and watch, and when Tommy asked questions, Earl answered them. It reminded Earl of himself at 12, standing beside his father in 1938, watching goats work a field that everyone said was lost. The difference was, Earl's father had been there to teach him. Earl had no one to teach, until now. The last week of June brought a letter from the bank. Not a second letter of follow-up. A bank representative would be visiting the property on August 15th to conduct a visual assessment of the land improvement progress. If no substantial improvement was noted, the bank would initiate a formal reevaluation of the loan terms, which could include acceleration of payment or restructuring of the collateral agreement. Earl read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in the drawer with the first one. He didn't tell anyone about it. He didn't call the bank. He just went back to work. The goats didn't know about the bank. They didn't know about assessments or reevaluations or loan terms. They knew the brush was food and they were hungry, and every morning they went back to the same work they had done the day before. July came to Harlan County with the kind of heat that made the air shimmer above the asphalt and turned afternoon into something people endured rather than lived through. The goats didn't notice. They worked the brush at the same methodical pace in 90-degree heat that they had worked it in the mild mornings of late June, and Earl Sutton moved the polywire fence in sections, opening new areas as the goats finished old ones. By the second week of July, the cleared section along the western fence line had expanded to nearly 20 acres. The multiflora rose was dead at the root. In most places, the honeysuckle stripped to bare cane and collapsing under its own weight. The soil where it showed through was dark and loose, the kind of soil that hadn't seen sunlight in 3 years. Earl walked it every morning with his boots in the dirt, noting in his wire-bound notebook the condition of the surface, the state of the old root systems breaking down beneath it, the places where new growth tried to emerge and failed because the goats came back and took it before it could photosynthesize enough energy to survive. He told no one what he was seeing. He didn't need to. The land was showing the answer on its own. On July 14th, Phil Caudle came by to pick up a piece of borrowed equipment, a post-hole digger Earl had loaned him 2 weeks prior. Phil drove his truck around to the back of the property to load it, and when he stepped out, he stopped. The cleared section was visible from where he stood. Open ground, pale stumps, dark soil. Phil walked to the fence line without saying anything. He stood there for a long moment looking at what had been impenetrable growth 6 weeks ago. Then he looked at the section the goats were currently working, another 10 acres halfway through, already showing open patches where the canes had been stripped and the root energy was failing. Then he looked at Earl. Earl handed him the post hole digger. Anything else you need? Phil loaded the digger into his truck bed. He looked back at the field one more time. No, he said. That's all. He drove back to the feed store on Main Street and told the story with a different tone this time. Not mockery. Something closer to confusion. He said the west side of Earl's back 40 looked like it had been bush-hogged and raked clean. He said he hadn't believed it when he saw it. He said the goats were halfway through the next section and moving faster now that they had settled into the work. Dale Whitfield heard that version of the story at the diner on July 16th. He stirred his coffee for a long time and didn't say anything. That evening, he drove out to Earl's property. He didn't announce himself. He parked his county truck at the top of the drive and walked around to the back 40 on foot, hands in his pockets, the late sun throwing long shadows across the cleared ground. The section Phil had described was real. Dale stood at the fence for several minutes without speaking. The cleared acreage was undeniable. Soil visible. Roots dead or dying. The goats were 30 yards deep into the next section, already well into it. The does working separate lines through the thicket, while the billy worked the tall canes at the edge. Earl came up behind him quietly, the way men do who have spent their whole lives outdoors and learned to move without sound. How many acres is that? Dale said, finally not turning around. 22, Earl said. Give or take? In 5 weeks. Earl nodded. Dale turned to look at him. The Lexington crew said 2 days. 2 days to cut it, Earl said. It would have grown back. Dale was quiet for a moment. Multiflora rows, you cut it down. It sends up new canes from the crown. It doesn't die. The root system is still alive and it's got energy stored. That's right, Earl said. The goats eat the leaves before the plant can photosynthesize. They do it again the following day and the day after that. The root runs out of reserves, then it dies. Earl looked at him without expression. Your machine would have cost me $14,000, Earl said, and the brush would have been back inside 4 years. These goats cost me $900. I'll have them for 10 years or more. The land is going to be clear by October. Dale put his hands in his pockets. He looked at the field one more time. Why didn't you explain that when I came out here with the quote, he asked. Earl looked at him with something that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite patience. You had a clipboard, Earl said. I figured you were done listening before you started. Dale drove back to the extension office and sat in his truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes, engine off, windows down the evening, cooling around him. The next morning, he called the extension office in Lexington and asked them for the first time in his tenure if they had any data on targeted grazing for brush control using goats. The woman on the other end of the line told him there was actually quite a bit of research on it, primarily out of the western states, where it had been in practice for some years, and she would mail him the bulletins. He read them the following week. He read them twice. The data was clear. Targeted grazing with goats for woody invasive species control had been documented in Oregon, Idaho, and Washington since the mid-1960s. The research showed consistent results. Goats reduce brush density by 60 to 80% over a single growing season, with minimal regrowth in subsequent years due to root system depletion. Cost per acre ranged from $15 to $40, depending on animal density and terrain, compared to mechanical clearing costs of $300 to $600 per acre, with regrowth rates of 30 to 50% within 3 years. The science supported everything Earl Sutton had told him. Dale set the bulletins on his desk and looked out the window at Main Street. He had spent 2 years promoting mechanical land management. He had printed brochures. He had given presentations. He had told Earl Sutton to his face that goats would not work, and he had been wrong. On July 28th, Dale's supervisor, a man named Robert Hensley, who managed agricultural programs for the county, from an office in the courthouse, called him in for a meeting. I got a call from the Lexington contractor, Hensley said. The one you arranged the mulcher quote for. They're asking what happened to the Sutton contract. Dale sat across from Hensley's desk, hands folded in his lap. Earl Sutton decided to use a different method. What method, goats? Hensley looked at him for a long moment. Goats? Yes, sir. And you're telling me this works? I drove out there twice, Dale said. The brush is clearing faster than the mulcher would have cleared it, and the root systems are dying instead of regrowing. It's documented. I have research from Oregon and Idaho that supports it. Hensley leaned back in his chair. The contractor says you've been interfering with potential business. Says other farmers in the county are asking about goats now, instead of hiring equipment. Dale didn't respond immediately. He had known this was coming. Are they asking? Hensley said. Yes, sir. How many? 3 so far. Hensley was quiet. Then, Dale, our job is to support modern agricultural practices, not to undermine the equipment contractors we work with. Our job, Dale said carefully, is to give farmers accurate information so they can make informed decisions. Don't get smart with me. Dale met his eyes. I'm not being smart. I'm being honest. Targeted grazing is a documented, scientifically supported land management method. It costs less, it's more effective for certain applications, and it's more sustainable. If farmers are asking about it, I have an obligation to provide accurate information. Hensley stared at him. You're on thin ice, Whitfield. Yes, sir. Dale left the courthouse and drove straight to Earl's farm. He found Earl in the barn checking the hooves of one of the does. The animal stood patiently while Earl worked trim the overgrown edges with a pair of hoof shears and set the foot down gently. They're working hard on rough ground, Earl said without looking up. Got to stay on top of the feet or they'll go lame. Dale leaned against the barn door. I just got called into my supervisor's office. The Lexington contractor is complaining that I'm interfering with their business. Earl moved to the next hoof. Are you? I'm telling people the truth. That'll do it, Earl said. Dale was quiet for a moment. My supervisor told me I'm on thin ice. Said I need to stop talking about goats. Earl set the hoof down and straightened up slowly, one hand on the small of his back. He looked at Dale. What are you going to do? Earl asked. Dale thought about it. Keep talking about goats. Earl nodded. Good. They stood in the barn for a while without speaking. Outside, the heat pressed down on the county like something with weight. The goats were in the back, 40 heads down, working. They didn't know they were the center of a bureaucratic dispute. They were simply hungry, and the brush was there, and that was enough. You ever been told you were wrong when you knew you were right? Dale asked. Earl picked up his tools and set them on the workbench. Every day of my life until I stopped caring what people told me. How'd you stop caring? I didn't. Earl said, I just started trusting the land more than I trusted the opinions. By mid-August, the heat had turned brutal. 95 degrees in the shade, the kind of weather that made livestock stand motionless under trees and made men reconsider the value of outdoor work. The county assumed the goats would slow down. They didn't. They worked the brush at the same steady pace they had worked it in June, and Earl moved the poly-wire fence in measured sections, opening new ground as the old ground cleared. On August 19th, a man named Gerald Fitch drove out to the property and asked Earl if he could walk the cleared sections. Gerald was 52, farmed 120 acres north of town, and had been watching Earl's situation with more attention than he let on. He had a back 30 that had the same problem, multiflora rose honeysuckle, sumac thick enough to stop a tractor. He had been quoted $18,000 by a different contractor out of Lexington, and he had been trying to figure out how to pay for it without taking a loan he couldn't afford. Earl walked with him for 40 minutes without saying much. Gerald asked questions. Earl answered them. At the end of the walk, Gerald stopped at the fence line and looked at the section the goats were currently working. How long for something like my back 30? Gerald asked. Depends on the density, Earl said. But figure a full season, maybe 5 months if you section it right and keep them on it. What do I look for in the animals? Earl told him. Boar cross does, a mature billy with weight and temperament. Avoid animals that have been kept on pasture, only they won't have the instinct for heavy brush. Look for scarred legs and worn hooves. That means they've worked. Gerald shook Earl's hand at the gate. Thank you. You're welcome. Gerald was back the following Saturday with a stock trailer. He had bought 6 goats from Virgil Combs, 4 does, and 2 billies, and he wanted Earl to look at them before he turned them loose on his own land. Earl walked the trailer, checked their feet, their coats, the way they held themselves. "They'll work," he said. Gerald nodded. "I'll let you know how it goes." Word moved through the county the way it always did through the co-op, through the feed store, through the parking lot after Sunday service. But the tone had shifted entirely. It was no longer a story about a foolish old man trading his ATV for goats. It was a story about a man who had known something for a long time that nobody else had bothered to learn. On August 24th, one of Earl's does went down. He found her in the morning lying in the shade of a sumac thicket, breathing shallow and fast. Heat stress. The temperature had been above 90 for 18 straight days, and even though the goats were tougher than most livestock, they had limits. Earl carried her to the barn, 60 pounds of dead weight in his arms, his back screaming at him the whole way, and set her in a stall with fresh water and a fan running. He checked her temperature, drenched her with electrolytes, and sat with her for 2 hours while she stabilized. She survived, but it was close. That evening, Tommy Prater found Earl sitting on the tailgate of his Chevy, looking at the back 40 in the fading light. "Is she okay?" Tommy asked. "She'll make it," Earl said. Tommy climbed up and sat beside him. They didn't talk for a while. The goat's 3 does and the billy, now the 4th doe, still recovering in the barn, were visible in the distance, still working their heads down in the brush. "What if she hadn't made it?" Tommy asked. "Then I would have lost her," Earl said. "Would you quit?" Earl looked at him. "No, why not? Because the work doesn't stop when it gets hard," Earl said. "The work stops when it's done." Tommy thought about that. "My dad says you're stubborn. Your dad's probably right." They sat in the cooling evening, the cicadas starting up in the trees, the light going bronze and soft across the cleared ground. The back 40, what had been a wall of impenetrable growth in June, was open now across most of its length. 40 acres cleared, another 20 in progress. The old fence row section where the brush had been thickest was still waiting. But even from where they sat, Earl could see the progress. The canes were stripped. The root energy was failing. Open ground was appearing at a rate that was to anyone watching carefully undeniable. "Mr. Whitfield came by yesterday," Tommy said. "Talked to my dad about goats." Earl didn't respond. "Dad's thinking about it," Tommy continued. "Says if it works for you and Mr. Fitch, maybe it'll work for us." Earl nodded slowly. "You changed people's minds," Tommy said. "No," Earl said. "The goats did. I just let them work." On September 4th, Earl opened the last section of polywire fence and let the goats into the final portion of the back 40. The brush here was the thickest the old fence row that had expanded outward for 20 years. Multiflora rose in canes as thick as broom handles, honeysuckle matted 10 feet deep in places. It was the section Dale Whitfield had specifically referenced when he said the forestry mulcher was the only realistic option. Earl watched the goats go in. The billy went first, as he always did, bending the tall canes with his chest and beginning to strip bark before he had taken 5 steps. The does followed in their particular unhurried way, spreading out each one working her own line into the thicket. Earl sat on the tailgate of his Chevy and ate his lunch and watched them. 4 weeks, he thought, maybe 5, and then it would be done. The bank representative arrived on August 15th, exactly as the letter had said. His name was Marcus Webb, and he was younger than Earl expected, maybe 40, wearing khakis and a short-sleeve button-down that already had sweat marks under the arms despite the early hour. He carried a clipboard and a camera. Earl met him at the gate to the back 40. They shook hands. Marcus looked at the cleared ground beyond the fence, then down at his clipboard, then back at the ground. "This is the northwest parcel," Marcus asked. "That's right," Earl said. Marcus walked along the fence line, taking photographs, making notes. Earl followed at a distance, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. After 20 minutes, Marcus stopped and turned around. The assessment from May indicated this area was entirely overgrown with invasive brush species, he said. Multi-floor rows honeysuckle woody vegetation averaging 6 to 8 feet in height across approximately 40 acres. That's what it was, Earl said. Marcus looked at his clipboard again, then at the cleared ground. What method did you use for removal? Goats, Earl said. Marcus wrote something down. He looked back at the field. He took another photograph. When did you start the clearing process? June 9th. Marcus did the math in his head. That's approximately 65 days, give or take, Earl said. And the remaining section, Marcus pointed at the old fence row area where the goats were currently working. Should be done by mid-October. Marcus made another note. He looked at Earl, then back at the field, then at his clipboard again. He seemed to be trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what his paperwork told him should be there. Mr. Sutton, the projected cost for mechanical clearing of this parcel was estimated at $14,000 to $16,000 with completion timeline of 3 to 5 days. Your method? Cost me $900, Earl said. The goats, Marcus was quiet for a moment. 900, yes. And they're still working. They are. Marcus took one more photograph. He made a final note on his clipboard, then extended his hand. I'll file my report this afternoon, he said. Based on what I'm seeing here, I expect the bank will consider this matter resolved. They shook hands. Marcus walked back to his car, got in, and drove away. Earl stood at the gate and watched until the dust settled on the drive. Then he turned back to the goats. The billy was working a thick stand of sumac stripping bark in methodical pulls. The does were spread across the section, each working her own territory. They didn't know a bank representative had just come and gone. They didn't know that what they were doing had just saved 80 acres from foreclosure. They were just hungry, and the work was there, and that was enough. Dale Whitfield drove out to Earl's property on the morning of September 28th without calling ahead. He had been avoiding it, avoiding the conversation he knew he needed to have, but avoidance had stopped being an option 3 days ago, when Robert Hensley told him the county commissioners wanted a formal presentation on modern land management practices for the October meeting, and they specifically wanted to know why 3 farmers had switched from contracted mechanical clearing to livestock grazing in the past 2 months. Dale had spent those 3 days writing a report he knew would either validate his position or end his career, and he had come to terms with the fact that he didn't care which one it was anymore. He parked his county truck behind Earl's Chevy on the gravel and walked around to the back of the property without going to the house first. What he saw stopped him cold. The back 40, all 80 acres of it, was open, not cleared like a machine had been through. Cleared the way land clears when the cause of the growth is removed. The soil was dark and loose where the goats had worked longest. The multi-floor rows was dead or dying in visible stages across the acreage. The honeysuckle stripped and restripped across months of work had collapsed into brown tangles against the ground. The old fence row section where the goats had been working for less than 4 weeks was still in process. But even there, the canes were stripped. The root energy was failing and open ground was appearing at a rate that was impossible to deny. Dale stood at the edge of it for a long time. Earl came up behind him quietly. He didn't say anything. He just stood beside Dale and looked at the land the way a man looks at something he has known his whole life and still finds worth studying. October, Earl said finally. That last section will be done by the 3rd week of October. Dale didn't turn around immediately. He kept looking at the field, at the work that 4 animals and 1 stubborn man had accomplished in less than 4 months. Work that Dale had told him publicly and repeatedly would not be possible. I owe you an apology, Dale said. You don't, Earl replied. I stood in your driveway and told you those animals would be standing in the same brush come September. I was wrong. I was publicly wrong, and I said it to a lot of people. Earl looked at him without any expression that could be called satisfaction. You came back. A lot of people don't. Dale turned to face him. I read the research. After I saw what was happening here in July, I called Lexington. There are programs out West Oregon, Idaho that have been using targeted goat grazing for brush and invasive species control for 20 years. It's documented. It has data behind it. He stopped. It wasn't in the bulletins I was given. No, Earl said. The bulletins told me machines were the answer. For some jobs, they are, Earl said. For this kind of brush, on this kind of land, the machine cuts the top and leaves the root, and the root comes back. You'd have spent $14,000 on a problem that would have restarted itself inside 4 years. Dale took his cap off and held it. What would you have spent across 4 years? Earl thought about it. Grain and mineral supplement for the animals, electric fence, time. He paused. $800, maybe a little more. Dale put his cap back on. Could I bring some of the farmers I work with out here? Show them what this looks like, Earl said. That was fine with him as long as they didn't bother the goats. Dale put out his hand. Earl shook it. The handshake lasted one beat longer than normal, the way it does when something is being acknowledged that neither man is going to say out loud. 3 days later, Dale stood in front of the Harlan County Agricultural Extension Office's monthly meeting, 42 farmers, 6 county commissioners, and Robert Hensley in the back row, with his arms folded, and presented a revised land management practices report that included, for the first time in 6 years, a section on targeted grazing for woody invasive species. He had written the section himself. He had driven out to Earl's property twice during the writing of it and asked questions. Earl had answered them from the tailgate of his truck with the same lack of ceremony he brought to every other task. Dale presented the data. He showed the research from Oregon and Idaho. He showed photographs of Earl's back 40 before and after taken 4 months apart. He presented the cost comparison, $14,200 for mechanical clearing, with documented regrowth rates of 30 to 50% within 3 years versus $900 for livestock, with documented regrowth rates of less than 5%. The room was silent when he finished. One of the commissioners, a man named Vernon Hale, who had farmed tobacco for 40 years, raised his hand. Is Earl Sutton here? Vernon asked. Dale looked toward the door. Earl was standing in the back, arms folded, expression unreadable. He had come at Dale's request, though Dale had not told him why. He is, Dale said. Vernon stood up. Earl, would you mind coming up here and answering some questions? Earl didn't move for a moment. Then he walked to the front of the room slowly and stood beside Dale. He did not take the podium. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, waiting. How long did it take? Vernon asked. 4 months, Earl said, give or take. And the goats are still alive. They are. What do you do with them now? They'll graze the pasture through winter, Earl said. Come spring, I'll see if Gerald Fitch needs more clearing done or if somebody else does. They'll earn their feed. Another farmer, a younger man Dale didn't recognize, stood up. Why didn't you tell anybody this would work? Earl looked at him. I told your father about it 2 years ago. I told Gerald Fitch. I told Ray Bellamy, who thought I was making a poor trade, and told me so. He paused. People hear what they're ready to hear. That's not something you can fix. You just keep doing what you know is right and let the land show the answer. Phil Caudle stood up from the third row. Earl, I owe you an apology. I laughed at you when you bought those goats. I told half the county you were wasting your time. Earl looked at him. You came back and looked at the work. That's more than most people do. Ray Bellamy stood up next. I thought you were crazy when you sold me that four-wheeler. I was wrong. Earl nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just acknowledged it the way a man acknowledges a fact that doesn't need elaboration. The meeting continued for another hour. Farmers asked questions about animal selection, fencing, feed costs, timeline expectations. Earl answered them all in the same measured tone he used for everything else. When the meeting ended, 7 farmers approached Dale to ask about setting up site visits to their properties to assess brush clearing needs. Not one of them asked about mechanical contractors. Robert Hensley found Dale in the parking lot afterward. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, you were right, Dale nodded. Yes, sir. Don't make me regret backing you on this. I won't. Hensley got in his car and drove away. Dale stood in the parking lot and watched the taillights disappear down Main Street. Then he turned and saw Earl leaning against his Chevy, waiting. Thank you, Dale said. For what? For not making me look like an idiot up there. Earl straightened up. You made yourself look honest. That's better. He got in his truck and drove home. By the first week of October, Gerald Fitch's 30 acres were showing visible progress 2 months into the work, with 20 acres already cleared and the remaining 10 in process. Gerald kept meticulous notes the same way Earl did, and he brought them to the feed store one Saturday morning to show anyone who wanted to see. The total cost so far, $640. The goats were still working. Phil Caudle put a handwritten note on the feed store bulletin board. Ask about goats before calling any contractor. It stayed there for 3 years. The Lexington company that had quoted Earl the $14,000 job called the extension office in November to ask what had happened to the Sutton contract. Dale explained it over the phone calmly and without editorializing. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "We've never heard of that approach being used in Kentucky," the man from Lexington said. "It's been used in Harlan County for at least 50 years by at least one farmer," Dale replied. "Probably longer than that." The man didn't call back. On the third Saturday in October, Tommy Prater came by Earl's property and found him in the barn with the 4 goats. Earl was checking their feet. The work had been hard on them across a long season, and he was particular about hoof care. The animals stood in their unhurried way while he worked accustomed to his hands. Tommy sat on a hay bale and watched. "Is it all done?" he asked. "All done," Earl said without looking up. "What happens to them now?" "They'll graze the pasture through winter. Come spring, I'll see if Gerald needs more clearing done or if somebody else does. They'll earn their feed." Tommy was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Whitfield said you should come speak at the extension office meeting in December." Earl moved to the second animal's near foreleg. "Did he said you know things that aren't written down anywhere?" Earl worked quietly for a moment, trimming the hoof with careful precision. "Most things worth knowing aren't written down anywhere. They're in the land. You read the land the same way you read anything else. You pay attention. You come back the next day, you pay attention again. You do that for 30 years and you start to know something." He set the hoof down and straightened up slowly, one hand on the small of his back. "The problem with written down things," Earl continued, "is that by the time somebody writes them down, somebody else has already been doing them for 50 years and nobody noticed." Tommy turned this over in his head. Then, "Will you teach your son these things?" Earl was quiet for a long moment. He set his tools on the workbench and looked at the boy. "I don't have a son," Earl said. Tommy's face fell. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't. But I could teach you," Earl said, "if you want to learn." Tommy looked up at him. "Really, if you're willing to show up and pay attention and come back the next day and do it again." Tommy nodded. "I am." "Then we'll start in the spring," Earl said, "after the ground thaws." They walked the goats out to the back pasture together. The animals moved into the late afternoon without any particular interest in being watched, their heads down, working the ground the way they always had. Earl latched the gate and stood there for a moment in the cooling air. The back 40 was open behind him. 80 acres of ground that had been locked under growth for years now, ready for whatever came next. He didn't stand there long enough for it to become a moment. He turned and walked back to the barn, Tommy following a step behind. The winter of 1987 was mild by Kentucky standards. The goats grazed the pasture, their coats thick against the cold, and Earl kept his fences and checked them twice a week the way he always had. The county moved on to other concerns. The story of Earl Sutton and his goats settled into local lore not as a joke anymore, but as a fact, the way facts do when they are proven too thoroughly to be dismissed. Dale Whitfield's extension office distributed the updated land management guidelines in January. The section on targeted grazing was 8 pages long with the photographs, cost analyses, research citations, and step-by-step implementation procedures. Dale sent a copy to Earl in the mail with a handwritten note that said simply, "Thank you for your patience." Earl read it once, filed it in the drawer with the bank letters, and went back to work. In March of 1988, Tommy Prater started coming by after school 3 days a week. Earl taught him how to read soil by feel, how to recognize root rot in a fence post, how to section a field for grazing so the animals work thoroughly instead of ranging and skipping. He taught him the way his own father had taught him, by showing him, by letting him try, by correcting him when he got it wrong, and saying nothing when he got it right. One morning in early April, Earl walked out to the back 40 with Tommy following. The ground was soft from spring rain, and the soil was dark and ready. Earl knelt down, pulled a handful of dirt, and held it up. He didn't say anything. He just let the boy look. The weight of it, the texture, the way it held together, and the way it crumbled. 50 years ago, Earl's father had done the same thing. Now Earl was doing it again. Tommy reached out and took the handful of soil. He felt the weight of it in his palm. "What am I looking for?" Tommy asked. "Everything," Earl said, "if you pay attention long enough." They stood there for a while in the morning light, the back 40 open and quiet around them, the goats working the far pasture, the land breathing the way land does when it is no longer fighting to survive. Over the next several weeks, Earl showed Tommy how to move the polywire fence, how to read the animal's behavior for signs of illness or stress, how to check hooves without getting kicked. Tommy asked questions constantly. Some Earl could answer, some he couldn't, and he told the boy honestly which was which. "Why don't more people do it this way?" Tommy asked one afternoon in late April. They were sitting on the fence rail watching two of the does work a section of new growth that had tried to establish itself along the tree line. Earl thought about it for a while before answering. "Because it's slow," he said. "Because you can't schedule it like you can schedule a machine. Because it requires you to pay attention every single day for months. Because there's no guarantee and people want guarantees. But it works. It works if you trust it," Earl said. "Most people would rather pay money for certainty than invest time and patience." Tommy watched the goats for a moment. "Do you think I could do this?" "On my dad's place?" Earl looked at him. "How much brush has he got?" "Maybe 15 acres. Along the back creek." "What kind?" "Mostly honeysuckle. Some multiflora." Earl nodded. "You'd need 3 does. Maybe 4. 6 months of work if you section it right." Tommy's eyes lit up. "Could you help me convince him?" "I could talk to him," Earl said. "But the convincing that's going to come from you showing him you're serious enough to do the work." Over the next month, Tommy showed up every day after school. He helped Earl repair fence, move the goats to fresh pasture, check the cleared sections for regrowth. He took notes in a small spiral notebook Earl gave him, copying the same format Earl used. Date, weather observations were completed. In mid-May, Tommy's father, Marcus Prater, drove over to Earl's place and found the two of them in the barn working on a broken gate latch. Earl, Marcus said, "Tommy's been talking my ear off about goats." Earl looked up from the latch. "Has he says you've been teaching him?" "I have." Marcus looked at his son, then back at Earl. "He's 14. I'm not sure he understands what he's asking for." Earl set down his tools. "What do you think he's asking for?" Marcus shifted his weight. "He's asking me to let him try clearing the back 15 acres with goats instead of paying somebody to come in with equipment." "That's right," Earl said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Earl, I appreciate you spending time with him. But that's a lot of responsibility for a boy his age." "It is," Earl agreed. "That's why I told him the convincing had to come from him, not me." Marcus looked at Tommy. "You really think you can do this?" Tommy nodded. "Yes, sir." "How?" "I've been learning from Mr. Sutton. I know how to section the field, how to move the fence, how to check the animals. I've been taking notes. I can show you." Tommy pulled out the spiral notebook and handed it to his father. Marcus flipped through the pages, neat entries, careful observations, sketches of fence layouts and grazing patterns. Marcus looked at Earl. "You think he's ready?" "I think he's willing to learn," Earl said. "That's half the work right there. The other half is showing up every day and paying attention. If he does that, he'll figure out the rest." Marcus handed the notebook back to Tommy. "How much would this cost?" Tommy looked at Earl. Earl nodded for him to answer. 4 does, Tommy said. "Maybe $600 if we buy them from Mr. Combs. Polywire and post another 100. Feed supplement through the season, maybe 150. Total, around 850. And how much would equipment cost?" Tommy had done the math. "Mr. Whitfield quoted us $4,800 for a contractor with a mulcher." Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, if you do this, you're responsible for it. Every day, rain or not, school or not. Those animals are your job. Yes, sir. And if it doesn't work, it'll work, Tommy said. Marcus looked at Earl one more time. Earl didn't say anything. He just met the man's eyes and waited. All right, Marcus said finally. We'll try it. Tommy bought his first 4 goats in early June with money he had saved from 2 summers of farm work and a loan from his father that he would pay back with his own labor. Virgil Combs helped him select the animal's 3 young does and a mature doe that had worked brush before. Earl went with them and checked the animals himself, nodding his approval at Tommy's choices. The boy set up his first section of polywire fence on June 12, 1988, exactly 1 year and 3 days after Earl had turned his own goats loose on the back 40. Earl stood at the fence and watched Tommy open the gate and let the animals into the brush for the first time. The boy was nervous. Earl could see it in the way he double-checked the fence connections, the way he watched the goats with an intensity that bordered on worry. They know what to do, Earl said quietly. Tommy nodded but didn't look away from the animals. The lead doe, the mature one with experience, moved into the honeysuckle without hesitation. The younger does followed. Within 5 minutes, they were working the canes, stripping leaves, testing bark. Tommy let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Earl put a hand on the boy's shoulder. Now comes the part nobody talks about. What's that? The waiting, the showing up tomorrow and the day after that, the watching and the adjusting and the trusting that the work is happening even when it doesn't look like much. Tommy looked up at him. How long before I see progress? 3 weeks, Earl said. Maybe 4. Depends on the density. What if I mess it up? You will mess it up, Earl said. Everyone does. The question is whether you pay attention to what you messed up and fix it the next time. They stood at the fence for a while longer, watching the goats work the late afternoon sun, throwing long shadows across the pasture. Thank you, Tommy said. For what? For teaching me. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then my father taught me the same way when I was about your age. I never had a son to pass it on to. So this, he gestured at the goats at the boy at the work beginning in front of them. This is how it's supposed to work. By July, Tommy's goats had cleared 2 acres of the 15. It was slow work, exactly as Earl had told him it would be. Tommy moved the fence every week, checked the animals every morning. Before school, walked the cleared sections every evening. He kept notes in his spiral notebook, recording progress in the same format Earl used. His father came out to look at the work in mid-July and stood at the fence for a long time without saying anything. Then, you were right. Tommy looked at him. About what? About it working. Marcus called Earl that evening. They talked for 20 minutes, the longest conversation Earl had had on the telephone in 5 years. Marcus asked questions about maintenance, about what to expect in year 2 and year 3. Earl answered them all, patient and thorough. When Marcus hung up, he found Tommy in the barn. I owe you an apology, Marcus said. Tommy looked up from the grain bucket he was cleaning. For what? For not believing you could do this. Tommy set the bucket down. You let me try. That's what mattered. Marcus nodded. He looked at his son for a moment, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't noticed before. The boy was growing up, not just getting older, but growing into someone with knowledge and capability and patience. Mr. Sutton's been good to you, Marcus said. Yes, sir. You've been listening to him, every word. Good, Marcus said. Keep doing that. By September, word had spread through the county that the Prater boy was clearing his fathered Back Creek section with goats and that it was working. 3 more farmers contacted Dale Whitfield at the extension office to ask about targeted grazing. Dale sent them to Earl, and Earl sent them to Tommy. The boy found himself at 14 years old explaining to men twice and 3 times his age how to section a field, how to select animals, how to move fence. He did it with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned from someone who knew, and the men listened because they could see the work behind him, the cleared ground, the dying brush. In October, Earl and Tommy stood at the fence of the Prater property and looked at 8 acres of cleared land. The honeysuckle was gone. The multiflora was dead at the root. The soil was dark and loose. Tommy's spiral notebook was full. He had started a second one. "You did good work," Earl said. "We've still got 7 acres to go. You will have it done by spring." Tommy looked at the cleared ground. "Do you think other people will keep doing this after we're done?" Earl thought about it. "Some will, some won't. The ones who need guarantees will go back to machines. The ones who have patience will stick with the animals." "Which kind are you?" Earl smiled, a rare thing, brief and genuine. "I'm the kind who trusts what my father taught me and what the land shows me. Everything else is just noise." They stood there in the cooling October air, two figures at a fence looking at work that had been done slowly and thoroughly and right. The inheritance wasn't the land, it was the knowledge of how to read it. And that knowledge was passing forward exactly the way it was supposed to. The winter of 1988 was harder than the previous year. Snow came in late December and stayed through January, and the temperature dropped into the teens for 2 straight weeks. Earl's goats grew heavy coats and stayed close to the barn. Tommy's goats did the same. Both men, 162, 114, checked their animals twice a day, broke ice and water troughs, hauled extra hay when the pasture disappeared under snow. Tommy came by Earl's place on a Saturday in mid-January, trudging through 6 inches of fresh snow. "One of my does is limping," he said. Earl put on his coat. They walked to the Prater place together, their breath visible in the cold air. Earl examined the doe's hoof, found an abscess, cleaned it, wrapped it, and showed Tommy how to do the same. "Check it every day," Earl said. "Keep it clean. She'll be fine in a week." Tommy nodded, watching carefully. "How did you know it was an abscess?" "Experience," Earl said. "You see enough problems, you start to recognize them before they get bad." They walked back to Earl's place in the fading afternoon light. The snow made everything quiet, the world reduced to the crunch of boots and the occasional call of a crow. "Mr. Sutton," Tommy said, "can I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "Why didn't you ever have kids?" Earl was quiet for a long moment. They reached his driveway before he answered. "Catherine and I tried," he said. "It didn't happen for us. After a while, we stopped trying and made peace with it." "Do you regret it?" Earl looked at the boy. "No, I used to, but not anymore." "Why not?" "Because teaching you this past year taught me something," Earl said. "Family isn't just blood, it's what you pass on, and I'm passing this on to you." "That's enough." Tommy didn't say anything for a while. Then, "Thank you." Earl nodded. "Come on, let's get you some coffee before you walk home." They sat at Earl's kitchen table, the same table where Earl had read the bank's letters 9 months ago, and drank coffee while the winter evenings settled around them. Earl told him stories about his father, about the Depression, about learning to read land when there was no money for mistakes. Tommy listened the way Earl had once listened to his own father, absorbing not just the words, but the way they were said, the pauses, the weight of experience behind them. When Tommy finally left, walking back through the snow toward his own place, Earl stood at the window and watched until the boy disappeared around the bend. Then he sat back down at the table and opened his wire-bound notebook. He turned to a clean page and wrote the date. Below it, he wrote, "Taught Tommy about hoof abscesses today. He's learning well. Asks good questions. Pays attention." Then he closed the notebook and went to check his own animals one last time before dark. Spring came late in 1989. The ground didn't thaw until mid-March, and the first real warmth didn't arrive until April. But when it came strong, and the pastures greened up fast. Tommy's goats finished the last 7 acres of his father's property by the end of May. 15 acres cleared completely in just under a year. The total cost had been $870. Marcus Prater had the land surveyed in June, and the county assessor increased the property value by 12% based on the improved tillable acreage. Marcus paid Tommy back the money he had loaned him, plus interest. Then he asked his son what he wanted to do with the goats. "Keep them," Tommy said. "Mr. Garrison asked if I could clear his back 20. Said he'd pay me." "How much?" $1,200. Marcus looked at his son. "You negotiated that yourself?" "Yes, sir." "What did Mr. Sutton say?" Tommy smiled. He said I should have asked for 1,500. Marcus laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes from pride. You're turning into a businessman. I'm turning into a farmer, Tommy said. By the summer of 1989, targeted grazing with goats had become an established practice in Harlan County. 8 farms were using the method. Dale Whitfield's extension office had fielded inquiries from 3 neighboring counties. The Lexington contractor had quietly dropped their prices by 15% and had started offering a hybrid service that combined mechanical clearing with follow-up goat grazing. Phil Caudle's feed store started stocking minerals and supplements specifically for meat goats. Virgil Combs expanded his breeding program and sold 43 animals that year, more than triple his previous high. The story had shifted entirely. It was no longer about an old man who traded his ATV for goats. It was about a practice that worked, that saved money, that made sense. Earl Sutton, at the center of all of it, remained exactly as he had always been. He worked his land, he checked his animals, he kept his notes. He answered questions when people asked them, and he said nothing when they didn't. On a warm evening in late June, Dale Whitfield drove out to Earl's place and found him sitting on the tailgate of his Chevy, looking at the back 40 in the golden light. Dale got out of his truck and walked over. Mind if I join you? Earl gestured to the space beside him. Dale climbed up and sat down. They sat in silence for a while, watching the goats graze in the distance. I've been thinking about something, Dale said. What's that? A year ago, you were the laughingstock of the county. Now you're the reason 8 farms have changed their entire approach to land management. Earl didn't respond. You never seem bothered by the laughing, Dale continued. And you don't seem particularly pleased by the recognition now. Why is that? Earl thought about it. Because neither one changes the work. The work is what it is. People's opinions about the work that's separate. Dale nodded slowly. I spent 2 years building a program I thought was helping people. Turns out I was mostly helping equipment contractors. You were doing what you were taught, Earl said. That's not a crime, but I should have known better. Maybe, Earl said, or maybe you learned when you were ready to learn. Either way, you changed. That's what matters. Dale was quiet for a moment. I wanted to say thank you for being patient with me. Earl looked at him. You came back and looked at the work. You admitted when you were wrong. You changed your mind based on evidence. That's more than most people do. They sat together as the sun dropped lower, painting the cleared land in shades of amber and bronze. The back 40 that had been locked under brush 14 months ago was now open pasture productive ground land that would support whatever Earl decided to do with it next. I'm putting in a garden, Earl said suddenly. Dale looked at him. A garden. 20 by 30. Right there. Earl pointed to a section of the cleared ground near the barn. My father used to have a garden in that spot before the brush took it over. When are you starting? Already started. Turned the soil last week. Tommy's helping me put in the fence post tomorrow. Dale smiled. From goats to gardens. It's all the same thing, Earl said. You read what the land needs. You give it what the land needs. Then you wait and watch and adjust. They sat until the light faded and the fireflies began to rise from the grass. Then Dale climbed down from the tailgate and shook Earl's hand. Thank you, Dale said again. Earl nodded. Drive safe. Dale got in his truck and drove away. Earl sat on the tailgate for a while longer, listening to the evening sounds. Crickets, a distant owl, the soft bleating of goats settling for the night. The land was ready. The work continued. And Earl Sutton, who had never needed the county's approval and had never asked for its recognition, sat in the place his grandfather had cleared in 1911 and felt for the first time in a very long time that what he was leaving behind might be enough. Not the land itself. The land would go to someone, eventually maybe Tommy, if the boy wanted it, or maybe someone else. That didn't matter. What mattered was the knowledge, the patience, the understanding that some things can't be rushed, can't be scheduled, can't be reduced to a spreadsheet or a 2-day contract. The understanding that an animal and a plant are both trying to survive, and the animal has more patience. That was worth passing on. That was worth the year of mockery, worth the bank's letters, worth every early morning and late evening of the past 14 months. Earl climbed down from the tailgate and walked to the barn. He checked the goats one last time, feet, coats, water. They were settled for the night, content healthy. He latched the barn door and walked back to the house through the gathering dark. Tomorrow he would start building the garden fence with Tommy. Next week they would plant. In 3 months there would be tomatoes and beans and squash growing in soil that had been locked under brush for years now, open to the sun, because 4 animals had done the slow work of killing roots while everyone else had laughed. Earl Sutton was 62 years old. He had no children. He had no heirs. But he had 80 acres of land that would outlast him, and he had a boy who was willing to learn. And he had knowledge that had come from his father and his father's father, and now that knowledge was passing forward the way it was always meant to. The inheritance wasn't the land, it was the knowledge of how to read it, and that knowledge finally had found its way home.